Good afternoon. My name is Diane Yu, and I understand that I should say, welcome on Brückentag, Bridge Day. Did I get it right? Okay, anyway, this is, I understand, a day after a bank holiday, so we are very honored that so many of you decided to come and share this afternoon with the Global Citizenship Commission. We're very thrilled that you wanted to join us. We hope you'll have some opportunities to ask questions, and we would like to make sure that those of you who do have questions can do so near the end of the program. As I said, I'm Diane Yu. I'm the Deputy President of New York University, the lead sponsor for the Global Citizenship Commission, but we are delighted to spend the whole day here in Bonn at the university, which has been a most gracious and generous host. It is my very first pleasure, as part of my role as MC today, to introduce to you Rector or President of the University of Bonn, Jürgen Formann, who is a very, who's previously, before he became the rector in 2009, served as the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science. He is a specialist in the field of German literature and theory. He received his degrees from the University of Münster and the University of Bielefeld. His many interests include theory and literature, media studies, history of philologies, and cultural history. He is a very distinguished member of this faculty and administration, and I believe on behalf of the university wishes to express his greetings. So I'd like to call Dr. Formann to the podium. Thank you.
Well, Honorable Chairman Brown, honorable members of the Global Citizenship Commission, dear Vice President Yu, by the way you pronounce my name very perfectly, thanks a lot for that. Dear colleagues Forster, Gabriel, and Sturmer, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. As rector of the Bonn University, it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to the university as well as the city of Bonn. We are indeed very proud of being the host for the second working session of the Global Citizenship Commission. Well, almost 66 years ago, on December 10th, 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It did so only 3 years after the world went through the worst carnage ever to be seen on a global scale with the killing fields of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Yet, war was not the only killer. As we Germans very well know, this war was based in the hate against people, be it because of their belief, their ancestry, or their sexual orientation, to name only a few aspects. In Europe, and especially in Germany, the Holocaust shows how a society closes its eyes or even willingly collaborates when neighbors, colleagues, and even friends are being taken away to be murdered. This university too has had willing conspirators among its staff and its students, and it is thus burdened with this guilt too. Well, the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was taken on that day in December 1948 in Paris after the horrors of the Second World War and the atrocities that were committed was a remarkable and necessary step in the attempt to civilize humanity. If we look at it today, this initial boldness sometimes puts us as members of what we consider modern societies to shame. For, beside all achievements, we must concede that we were not successful in all parts of the world in fulfilling its great promise, the promise that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was and still is. For most of the 30 articles, we easily find one or more nations, sometimes whole regions, that deny their citizens or a sizable part of their citizens the rights enshrined in the Declaration. Be it equality before the law, the freedom from arbitrary arrest, the right to a fair and public hearing, by an impartial and independent tribunal, the right to marry on your own will, the right to rest and leisure, the right to education, and the right for privacy, to name only a few issues. Some countries even deny the existence of a concept of truly universal human rights. So today, more than 6 decades after this adoption, you decided to re-examine the Declaration of Universal Human Rights. To do so is a formidable task, and therefore, honorable members of the Global Citizenship Commission, the spirit of those women and men who drafted and fought for the original Universal Declaration of Human Rights may strongly encourage you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm now looking forward to the report from the chair and following discussion with the audience. The foundation of the Federal Republic of Germany with the former capital Bonn was the attempt to establish in new societal structures a stable democratic society. In the perspective of this attempt, Bonn may be a good place for your session. Thank you very much for your attention, and again, welcome to Bonn and to our university. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Rector Vollmann. This afternoon we have a very exciting schedule. I will first talk very briefly about the role of NYU in helping to sponsor this event, but I also want then to introduce Michael Forster, who will speak on behalf of our 3 sponsoring entities here at the University of Bonn, who so kindly and generously helped support this effort to bring the commission here. After that, there will be some remarks by the chair of the Global Citizenship Commission, Gordon Brown. Following his remarks, there will be a panel discussion moderated by NYU President John Sexton, featuring 4 members of the commission, Anthony Appiah, Craig Calhoun, John Kafur, and Emma Rothschild. And following that part of the program, we will then open it up for some questions. We'll invite all of the commissioners on the stage, and we'll have a chance for some dialogue with you. So it is now a pleasure to introduce to you Professor Michael Forster. He was at the University of Chicago for 28 years, but he has been here at the university for a number of years, heading the Institute for Philosophy. He was at the University of Chicago the Glenn A. Lloyd Distinguished Service Professor. His historical work is on ancient philosophy, particularly German philosophy. His systematic work focuses on epistemology and philosophy of language. Professor Forster has published numerous articles and 7 books. He has been a remarkably helpful person as we were contemplating bringing the commission here, and it is a great pleasure to welcome to the podium Professor Michael Forster. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane, for that very kind introduction. I'm really here to speak for 3 people who've had equal roles in planning this event and also in raising the funding for it. Myself, Marcus Gabriel, and Dieter Sturmer. We're all professors in the philosophy department, but also in the International Center for Philosophy, Nordrhein-Westfalen, which Marcus Gabriel and I co-direct. First of all, I'd like to second the rector in his words of welcome, and also very much in the spirit of his remarks on the substance of this event. It would be difficult to think of a more important intellectual undertaking than the one that we have the privilege to be part of today. Even as I speak, millions of people worldwide are suffering from human rights abuses, many of them suffering in the sense of real physical agony, even death. In this context, against this background, the committee is meeting, the Global Citizenship Commission, I should say, is meeting to discuss revisions of the most important document designed to protect such people, such victims of human rights abuses, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the hope, of course, that the future may for such people be better than the past and the present. Before we get to the substance of this event, which will be a presentation of the deliberations of the Commission and a discussion thereof, I'd like to say a few words of thanks to specific institutions and individuals who were involved in planning this event. First of all, I'd like to thank the commissioners who have traveled from many different parts of the world in order to participate in the deliberations, in some cases also offer more individual public expressions of their ideas and their deliberations to us. And secondly, I'd like to thank NYU, New York University, for being the really the overall organizer of the sequence of events to which this belongs. In particular, my longtime colleague and friend Paul Boghossian and Diane Yu, who were both intensively involved in the planning of this. At Bonn University, besides the colleagues I have already mentioned, I'd also like to thank the rector, Dr. Foreman, the Chancellor, Dr. Lutz, both of whom supported this from the very start and throughout in the strongest way. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Stefan Zimmermann for invaluable practical help with the organization of the event. Next, I'd like to say thank you to three agencies, three institutions that provided the funding for the event. The Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, the Institute for Science and Ethics, and the German Reference Center for Ethics in the Biological Sciences. Without that funding, this event would not have been possible. Finally, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for showing up, because without you, this event would not have taken place, would not have a point. So welcome, and I hope that, like me, you're looking forward to what promises to be a very fascinating and worthwhile set of discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank both Michael Forster, Dieter Stürmer, and Marcus Gabriel. Thank you very, very much. I just wanted to spend a minute or two just to explain why and how we are here. The idea for the Global Citizenship Commission emerged out of a process of dialogues held at New York University, which we partnered with the Right Honorable Gordon Brown, who had an idea of convening academics, philosophers, lawyers, international human rights experts, NGO leaders, government leaders, and others to the New York University campus, where he was and is our first global distinguished leader in residence. As a result of several of these dialogues, which occurred during the years 2010 and 2011, the idea of a commission to deal with some of these various issues that emerged from these dialogues developed, and NYU was delighted to step in to serve as a lead sponsor. But it couldn't be possible without the help of other institutions, including for today's meeting, the University of Bonn, for which we're very grateful. Our initial meeting was held in Edinburgh, and it was co-sponsored by the University of Edinburgh and the Carnegie UK Trust. In the future months, we will be heading to the New York University Abu Dhabi campus in November and to Shanghai at the New York University campus there, because as some of you may know, New York University is a global network university with 3 degree-granting institutions worldwide and 12 global study way sites on 6 continents. So this is part and parcel of what NYU is seeing as an important and emerging set of developments, and we're delighted to sponsor it. We're also grateful because NYU's Global Institute for Advanced Studies, headed by Commission member Paul Boghossian, has offered support for the Philosophers Committee, which is a significant part of the Commission's sort of research help. As in the original creation of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Philosophers Committee helps provide the intellectual and philosophical underpinnings for the work of the Commission, and we're very grateful there. So this is why NYU is very excited about this, and we very much have enjoyed partnering with your institution and are delighted to be here.
I want to echo what has been said before. We're very, very pleased to be here. We have a great respect at NYU for this university, and it's a terrific thing to see some of you, and what we hope will bring some joy to your holiday. A word about the man who just left the stage. I've had the privilege of being his friend as well as his partner in this enterprise, but I've been an admirer of him for a long, long time. On the Commission, as you'll see, my role is principally, well, it's like the corpse in Finnegan's Wake, the great James Joyce novel. I'm in a way and we do this as university presidents. We're the thing that's necessary for the party, or for the funeral in the case of Finnegan's Wake. If you don't have a body, you can't have a funeral. If you don't have a president of a university or a vice chancellor, you can't have an event like this. So you'll find that my contributions, especially in this august group of commissioners led by the Prime Minister, my contribution is principally to help move things along. He is the one that galvanized this idea. We have learned at NYU, even the most extraordinary, and we're blessed on this commission with several Nobel laureates, one of whom will be with us later today when the members of the commission that were able to stay for this public-facing join us on the stage. We're blessed with an extraordinary Philosophers Committee. Paul Boghossian's already been mentioned. It would be wrong not to mention the extraordinary Jeremy Waldron, who has poured himself into this. Please stand. No, please stand and accept our... Jeremy has served as the chair, the driving intellectual force behind the Philosophers Committee, and then we bring together the commissioners whom you'll meet shortly. But all of us have been magnetized by the two proper nouns, Gordon Brown. We have all learned never casually to mention a book that you're reading or recommending to him, because the next time you see him, he not only will have read that and be prepared to discuss it with you in great detail, but he will have read everything else by the author. And he's a formidable intellect. Diane alluded to his extraordinary career as Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister. It's not been lost on me that the day in February of 2009 that Paul Krugman, the columnist for the New York Times, won the Nobel Prize for economics, and his Nobel Prize was announced on page 1. If you turn to the opinion page of the New York Times that day, Krugman's column had the title, "Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for charting the way the world should go if we're to come out of this crisis." And that combination struck me. Unfortunately, we didn't follow as a world, and part of the drag was my own country, that playbook that he gave us. But would you all please join me in saluting the man who really does bring us together, Gordon Brown. With that, as Diane explained, our format is relatively simple. I'm going to sit down. There's a seat here. There'll be an empty seat. It's not for Elijah. It's for Gordon Brown, who will come up later to join us. So I'm going to sit, leaving the empty seat on that end for Gordon. So I'm going to sit here. I'm also going to move it around a little bit so I can see the four panelists are about to come up. And I'm going to ask them each to come up. I'm not going to give them elaborate introductions. This is an extraordinary panel of people. And when you meet them, you'll see exactly why we have them, which is their ideas. So I don't want to take time away from that. So I'm going to ask them just to come up in alphabetical order, beginning with Anthony Appiah, who is world-renowned for... Now, the reason Gordon went off stage left was because I greet people with a hug. So I'll welcome Anthony, who I'm proud to say is a professor of philosophy at NYU. Then Craig Calhoun, who is the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. You'll excuse the NYU chauvinism, but Craig has been my colleague since 1981 at NYU, and we view him at NYU as being on loan to LSE. He's going to come home, we hope. We're sure he will. Gordon mentioned President John Kafur, former president of Ghana. John has just become the special envoy on climate change for the United Nations. And finally, a distinguished historian and economist, Emma Rothschild, who's the Knowles Professor of History at Harvard. You're going that way. She's also the director of the Center on History and Economics at Harvard. You can tell the people that wanted to avoid their second hug of the day. And with that, I'm going to sit down. And let me start with you, Anthony, because I brought you up first, and you write about the world and its interdependence, to pick up on Gordon's theme. Let's do a then and now. I'd ask each of the panelists to reflect for a moment on the then, spoken about so eloquently by both the Vice Chancellor and by the Prime Minister. The then, 1948, the setting then, the now, 66 years later. Obviously, tremendous change. What change, what aspects of the change or practices that you observe today? And to give you a time frame, we're about a year into the work of the Philosophers Committee. They've had 3 or 4 meetings between our meetings. We've had, as you've heard, first a meeting in Edinburgh. Now this is the second meeting. We're in process. This is not a final product as we work towards this. Which of the changes that you observed then and now would you say is most relevant to the assessment of the 1948 document that the Commission is doing?
I would pick decolonization, because in 1948, Ghana wasn't an independent sovereign nation, and the great round of African independences began we always say with Ghana, they're technically in Sudan, actually, but there was a whole bunch of independences, especially in the early 60s. So there's a whole new lot of countries that have come into existence since the General Assembly ratified the Declaration. And that means that the world that's being addressed has changed very radically. And it's an interesting thing that many of the countries, all of the countries basically that have joined as sovereign nations since then have, in one way or first of all, have adopted the Declaration, but also in one way or another, I think, have had things happen in their constitutions, in their politics, in their public discourse that depend upon the Declaration as a point of reference. That is, the Declaration and the rights that it, some more than others, but the rights that it mentions have become part of the sort of stock vocabulary of political life in all those new countries. And so it's established itself in the imagination of man and womankind in an astonishing way, really, when you think about what it was. It's just a declaration, right? And yet it's had this enormous effect. I think there are two other things I would like to mention quickly. One is the vast expansion since the declaration of what we now call international civil society, the vast expansion of NGOs, which I think are enormously important for the work of human rights, and the fact that one has to think of the declaration as not just addressing governments and not just addressing individual citizens, but as addressing all kinds of communities and organizations and institutions, especially in the world of human rights. And finally, the last of these three things that I think it's important to bear in mind is something that's changed in the character of the global system, which is the enormous, it's not just our great interdependence, it's our capacity for intercommunication person to person across the whole scope of the planet in, as we say, real time. That makes a difference to what these things mean. It means that each of us, as it were, has access to people in any place, in principle, and we all have an awareness of the things that were going on. The amazing thing about the Rwandan genocide is that it occurred before our eyes in a way that was different, for example, from the Shoah, from the Holocaust, which did not in that same sense occur before us. So I think those are three things that I'd like to put in play as having shifted in the interim and as being relevant. The first of them, the fact that this, after decolonization, the language of human rights has sort of gone everywhere. That's a thing to celebrate, I think, very much. NGOs to be celebrated often too, because they've helped to do that work of spreading it. And the World Wide Web, I think, is creating a new context for the idea of a global civil society, which we're the Global Citizenship Commission, because these human rights are the business of everybody.
So our colleagues here today in conversation should know that although we've worked together as a commission, and many of us are friends and colleagues, there's been no prior discussion or warning about the conversation. The preparation for it is the same preparation that any of the folks that have been on the commission would have. So as I turned to John, he has no idea that he was going to be the second person to whom I'm going to turn, and it's too irresistible. Anthony having raised the point about what I take it was his first claim, which was that there was some shaping influence of the 1948 Declaration in the framing and formation of nascent countries in Africa, including the one that you were president. How do you grade the professor? Do you agree with what he said? Do you embrace it fully? I'm tempted to say on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being metaphysical accuracy. How well did our philosopher do here as an observation of the importance of the document in the early stages of the formation of the Ghanaian country?
The document represents a dramatic, critical turnaround of the global development. It was the first time across the globe that visionary, foresighted people sat and decided that, yes, there were states, but perhaps the rationale, the justification for everything should be the human being. And so they decided to come out with a universal declaration of human rights. And they didn't discriminate. It wasn't West or East, black or white. It's humanity, human being. And that has been a driving force for the many changes that we are seeing. Since then, we see a great deepening of, is it conscience? The consciences of people around the world. And fortunately, this awakening or deepening is also being driven by a revolution, a technological revolution, which is enabling people, no matter where they are, in some of the remotest villages in the developing world these days, people have mobile phones. They press a button and they see what's happening in the streets of New York or in Tokyo or Beijing, in Europe. And so everybody is beginning to feel that he or she also counts. We are all human and we are entitled to the dramatic developments of development that people are seeing. In fact, we talk of culture, but what's happening is also a proof that even culture is dynamic. Now you come to some of the villages in my country, Ghana, which is a very young developing country.
Just for folks that may not know, tell them what was the year in which Ghana was founded? And you were not born. You were not born yet, of course.
1957. 1957.
And you were born
almost 10 years
15
after the declaration.
Yeah.
But Ghana was the first country, sub-Sahara, of the countries of sub-Sahara, to have gained independence from colonialism. And since then, Ghana became the pace setter. Whatever happened in Ghana vibrated all across the continent.
How old were you at the time?
I was just 57. I was about 18, 19 years old.
You were that old? Okay,
Yes.
I'm startled at that,
I'm
Mr.
just
President.
About,
Did you, as
finishing
a high school student, secondary school student, did you know the name Eleanor Roosevelt? Was the name Eleanor Roosevelt the name?
Of course.
Okay.
That great lady whose husband was the President of the United States at the conclusion of the Second World War. Everybody knew her, and knew her for the sense of humanity. She was always talking positive things about helping people. So we had pictures. We didn't have televisions in those times, but the occasional papers that came around enabled us to see the face. And of course, she lived longer, and into the 60s I had come to Europe. So I saw her and heard her on television.
Emma, what's the historian's view of this question I ask about the greatest change over this more than 6-decade period?
Well, I think to what Anthony has mentioned, and I should say that he and I are cousins. Yes. His mother and my mother were close cousins and close friends. I would add peace. The rector alluded to the origins and historical background of this great declaration. And while there have been desperate wars in the period since 1948, there has been an extraordinary human achievement in keeping the peace in many parts of the world, to do with European institutions around where we sit, but to do with UN institutions in the world as a whole. And that seems to me to be an enormous feature of the almost 70 years since the foundation of the UN. I'd mention the changing role of women and the changing recognition of children as persons deserving of respect and bearers of dignity. That is both the change in the role of women and the change in the place of children is a very large change, thinking of now and the late 1940s. I think there's a really interesting question for historians about an idea that's absolutely central to the work of this commission, which is the UN Declaration of Human Rights as a living enterprise, something that's not only a piece of paper that was signed then, but something that has had a continuing existence. And I must say, as someone who is sort of, again, like the rector, a cultural historian, aspires to be a historian from below, I think there's a marvelous undertaking, which really could be undertaken in 150 countries, or places that are now countries, about what the declaration did mean. I mean, there's anecdotal history about posters in Costa Rica with the Declaration of Human Rights, and about countries in the 1950s and individuals in the 1950s trying to make sense of the rather general exhortation to the world that they should keep the Declaration constantly in mind. But that's not just the piety or bureaucratic speak, as I'm afraid the great economist Hayek said about the Declaration. There's the reality to that. This is a document that has meant a lot of different things to people and that changes and to some extent grows, evolves over time. And I think just for historians, since you asked for the historian's take, that, like perhaps the history of the United Nations and its agencies itself, seen from below, is a wonderful subject.
I'm going to want to give Craig a chance to talk about this then and now, but in a moment I'll want to come back to you about the point you raise about women and children, and do you find an affirmation of their rights in the Declaration in 1948, or do you find it naturally in its spirit today? But let me give him a chance to do the then and thou question, because otherwise I may get a complaint from one of my former faculty members. So well, what do you see as the big tectonic changes that have occurred?
Well, thanks. I'm in agreement with my fellow panelists on this, but I'll add to the list. So and start with the change in the participation of women in society around the world is huge in this. So it's not just at that moment, but now. But a number of changes waged in struggle, that social movements throughout this period did things. I would say with the UN in mind that it's a complicated story, this tremendous optimism for what the UN was going to accomplish at the beginning and through a number of decades. And then the questions about whether the UN can live up to this optimistic promise today. At the moment, we have a vastly more interconnected world, as we've talked about. We've had huge economic growth, but we face some big changes. In 1948, the hegemony of the US was more or less complete and challenged by the Soviet Union and the Cold War. And we had decades of this. We had the large part of the history of these intervening years dominated by the Cold War, and we don't have that. We had a brief period where we had a single superpower in the US, but that superpower is losing some of its grip and choosing not to exercise the same role, and that creates an uncertainty in the world, a set of dangers. The last time we had this situation, in many ways, we had Britain and Germany as superpowers and a tension over it, and it didn't lead to a happy period of time entirely. I think we need to look with anxiety at this situation where there is a question about how world order is achieved. The Declaration of Human Rights has been linked to a whole range of struggles through this intervening period for women, for decolonized people, for racial equality, for a whole series of groups. It includes things like rights of labor and labor organization, freedom of association that have been pivotal in a range of countries. But I think we come to a period where we have to ask what's happening next. And we ask it without a sense of an alternative to global capitalism, without the socialist movements or communism or this sort of thing. We come to this question of what next with a more interconnected world economically and deep fragmentations and ruptures politically and difficulties in being able to achieve integrated global governance in any way. We come to it with this enormous advance in standards of living and yet an enormous increase in inequality at the same time. And so a history, it seems to me here, of these 66 years is a history in which there were huge achievements, many of them linked to the Declaration of Human Rights and to the living integration of human rights in struggles in which a variety of people won some gains in the world. These didn't just happen. They weren't just gifts. And yet we now see erosion of some of these gains. We see a very fraught global environment with local wars that could become interconnected on larger scale, with difficulties making the institutions like the UN live up to some of their promise for maintaining peace, for advancing human rights, for development more broadly. So I think we should look at the positive achievements in this, but notice the pretty dangerous present.
So, Emma, coming back, but through a slightly specific lens, you raised this huge change in the role of women and children. One of the first points brought to us as a commission was a very, very emotional plea from major human rights activists that we do no harm. That yes, things have changed, but focus on the iconic 1948 moment and educate about it, train in it, concentrate on better implementation and enforcement, viewed through the lens of the changed role or the changed dynamic involving women and children and the absence of explicit recognition of that in the 1948 document. What's your reaction to that? I mean, do you worry deeply about that we may inadvertently, in the course of opening the conversation, make situations that worse, moving away in this world that has just been described?
Yes, I worry about it, and I think the focus of the Commission on the Declaration as a living document, which every generation has to interpret and reinterpret in the light of the social and economic and other circumstances of that time, is absolutely essential to what we're trying to do. So I see this commission, and I wouldn't be involved if this were not the case. I see it as very much an affirmation of the Declaration and its importance. And we were actually, this is one of the things we were talking about in the working meeting earlier today. There are abstract provisions, phrases in the Declaration that are extraordinarily relevant to circumstances that couldn't have conceivably been thought of then. I mean, we were talking about freedom of what we would now call freedom of access to information, and it's there. They didn't know about the internet, but it's there. There is language about sex, and I think one can certainly think of the Declaration as making a clear statement against discrimination against women. I think the work and solemn treaty obligations in relation to the rights of the child are a very natural extension of the Commission's work. I think this may be my reading too much into those limpid phrases, but the word sex that appears there could be interpreted, could be discussed in relation to sexual orientation, which is another enormous area in which the period we've lived through has been one of very great liberation for human beings.
So there's a way, if I'm understanding your argument, that, and I should say this is broadly shared among us, that what you're arguing is that this is an organic document that shouldn't be frozen in time. It should be, even if we take Eleanor Roosevelt and put her here today, it should be, what would she say today if we incarnate the document as her? Granted, it wasn't, but...
Well, I hate to say this with an eminent US jurist, member of the Commission, but there is a debate in the United States about originalism and literal interpretation of the US Constitution. And I think there's no point in having declarations that are meaningful if you have to try and think yourself into the mindset of people in 1948 in order to make sense of them now. So that's saying, I think I'm saying something very different from that one should come up with a long list of new rights, which I'm myself I don't think certainly isn't a widespread view on the Commission that that's what we should be doing. We should be thinking about what the Declaration means.
Craig, you're nodding your head vigorously to this.
You know, the Declaration starts, among other things, with an affirmation of this idea of human dignity, and the notion, and John pointed to it, that all human beings have dignity, and from this follow a variety of rights. So it's not just a list of rights to which you might add this or that additional right. It's a proposition about all human beings, without regard to race or religion or gender and so forth. All human beings having an essential dignity which must be respected and preserved, but then which becomes the basis for recognizing a range of rights. And so it's important to think of, I think, that the rights are elaborating an underlying principle of human dignity, and we can further elaborate. So we can say there are things that didn't get listed in 1948 that also elaborate that notion of human dignity or elaborate one of the specific rights. So Emma referred to the point about media and communication, that the Commission, the original document from 1848, has very strong language that allows for all media. It says that there shall not be restrictions on people's ability to communicate with each other, to access and to both to receive and to send messages in all media. Obviously, they didn't know about the internet. It hadn't been invented, but this continues, and it speaks to present-day concerns about net neutrality. Similarly, there are questions that are raised today about things like privacy in relation to the internet. Well, there's a basis for looking at this living document and asking how we respect human dignity, how we combine the values on transparency and the values on privacy and come up with solutions in this framework. So I think there's tremendous potential in the existing Declaration of Human Rights, and the work of the Commission is not to revise that and write up a new Declaration of Human Rights, but to add to this and to add some addenda on how it fits well into the issues and life today, to connect it better into the present, not to undo it or redo it in any sense.
Anthony, you seem to want to add something.
Well, just to say that, so it's, as it were, ancestral, that the Declaration, to a whole body of covenants and treaties and so on, which have in various ways elaborated the meaning of the rather spare language of the Declaration, and it's been incorporated as well into national law in many places, either by reference in constitutional decisions or explicitly in the creation of constitutions. So it's got this continuing generative power, and the UN some of the UN High Commissioners refer back to this document when they're trying to think about questions that are new for the international community, though they may be old moral questions. So I think one should think of it as that's the sense in which it's living, and just as it would be absurd to, given this sort of great tree that's grown out of it, to think of doing anything other than, as it were, watering the roots and looking after them, knowing that there will be new branches and new leaves and new seasons. And I think that's the way to think about it, as something we develop and we live with. And that's why it's worth celebrating, and why the first do no harm idea is terrifically important, because it's done so much good. Now, it hasn't done all the good that it could have done, and so another dimension of our work is to think about how we can encourage the many people who are responsible for the maintenance of these rights, which includes each of us, but also governments, NGOs, corporations, many other bodies, the UN itself, the regional rights courts and so on. I mean, there are many institutions and people who have responsibility for this, and we need to figure out how to make the pressure to conform to the values more effective, since, as we've said, there have been many occasions in the last 60 years when not just the specifics of the document, but the very idea of human dignity has been under threat.
So, John, we've been given a great Ghanaian metaphor, this growing tree, and Anthony has raised, I think, an important issue on which you have particular province, and that is the role of the nation state in the I don't want to use the word enforcement, so I'm going to say the propagation, to carry out the metaphor, of the values that are in the 1948 Declaration and its progeny. So not speaking about Ghana in particular, although use whatever examples you want, how would you grade first of all, is it wrong to say that there is some reliance in the document, at least implied, that nation states will advance the cause and adhere to the values? And how would you grade the performance of nation states on your continent and around the world?
Africa, as you know, has been described as the last frontier of development. And it's not just physical development. In terms of rights development. Why? Because Africa has been independent for just the past 56 years. I told you Ghana was the first country to have gained independence from. And Africa finds itself having about 55 countries at different stages of development, both physical and I was almost going to say spiritual, but that's not it.
That's okay. My doctorate's in religion, so.
Yes. But if you look at Africa just over the past 2 decades, you'd see that Africa has moved away, or is moving away, it's not complete yet, from the times when it was held down by so-called strongmen. There were changes of government more by the force of arms than by constitutional electoral practices. But within the past 2 decades, majority of the countries are changing, going back to the constitution, not through arms. It's a marked advance from the days of the strongmen. And the history is only 50 years. But when you look at the constitutions across the countries, you would see that practically all of them embody at least articles or clauses from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of them. They say it doesn't mean in practice the governments respect, but why they would put, or the nations would put, parts of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the constitutional document that defines the state, that defines the rights of people, it's very significant to me. So Africa, I believe, is headed in the right direction. And to reinforce this point, you see that the African Union, which is the overarching authority on the continent now, has got in its constitutive act prescription on changing governments through democratic practices, acknowledgement of human rights, and also the enjoyment, or is it an injunction, that any body that would seize power by force of arms, not by constitutional process, is ostracized from the African Union and is applying. Recently, when the Egyptian army took over, forcibly from the elected authority, Egypt was blocked from membership. I do not know if it will be reinstated as a result of the recent election. But it means even Africa, the last frontier, is having to acknowledge the rights of people to make their governments and to unmake them. So I believe Africa is moving in the right direction. And the thing about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that it's like one of the great books in history, whether it's Bible or Quran. It seems to capture a timeless truth about the universality of man. And when I say man here, I include women. It's a matter of legal interpretation. Universality of humanity. So it's very forceful, and I believe perhaps it's early days yet for us to expect that within just 60 years, everything will be rosy under the declaration. I think from the achievement so far, one should be optimistic in time. We should hope that in due course, the global village would come to be populated by human rights.
Craig?
Well, I just want to add one thing, which is, you can look at this top-down and you can say, what's the UN doing? What is the EU? The EU is actually a very important force for human rights in certain areas. What's going on with national governments, whether in Africa or in other places and all this. But the other thing that's going on is empowering activists from the bottom up. And so, yes, in general, the EU has been a force for human rights advances. On issues like immigration, it's often activists who are taking what's enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or indeed in other charters and other national constitutions, and saying, this is the basis for work to try to improve human rights and to improve how my country is doing, how we're doing it here. And the same thing on a whole variety of rights, whether you're focused on the issue of trafficking, or you're focused on the issue of religious freedom, or you're focused on any other issue. The importance of human rights is often in facilitating activism from below. And in countries, the extent to which there is a respect for human rights is shaped by that activism. It's shaped by whether the citizens are campaigning and calling and pushing for the extension of the respect for human rights, not only by the decisions of high courts and legislators. And I think this is really important, and there are plenty of those issues, and they are in different places. They connect us also. So the issue of what's going on with the deaths in the Mediterranean of immigrants from Eritrea and Ethiopia and various places by way of Libya trying to get to Europe. Well, it's a story with African side and what's going on in various countries that pushes this. It's a story with the European side because it's largely a change in European rules to say that Europe would not accept applications for asylum from anyone in Africa. That if they made it to the European land, then they could apply, but not if they were still there. Well, that puts them on boats. It puts them on boats that sink. So we are all caught up in this, and there are people who are out trying to raise the issue, to attract attention to it, and to point out that it's a human rights issue in Eritrea and in Europe.
Emma, what are the role of international organizations in this? We have familiar names. Is the combination that's been described by John and Craig sufficient, or what do you see in terms of something beyond normative statements and exhortations, moving to a stage of genuine pressure?
Well, I think they're absolutely right that it's not only the agencies with UN in their names, but civil society organizations, universities are large multinational employers, multinational corporations have had a major role, sometimes for bad, sometimes for better in relation to human rights. But I would like to say something about really two populations who one of whom were very much at the forefront of people's minds in 1948, and one very much weren't. First, of course, is refugees, and the the UN's institutions substantially started to take care of what was thought of as a temporary refugee problem. Well, the refugee problem all around the world has turned out to be extraordinarily enduring over time, and refugees are among the people whose basic human rights and basic human dignity is violated in the most horrifying way. And if you think of the present, I mean, Syrian refugees, think of a country, namely Jordan, which is trying to live up to its obligations under the UN Declaration of Human Rights and treat Syrian refugees with human dignity. Now, the pressure on Jordan is immense from the people who are suffering and have left Syria. So these are situations that go right across traditional, national, and international boundaries of responsibility. The other population, which I think wasn't envisaged at all, is thought of now as a completely domestic problem. But if you look in my country, Gordon's and my country, the United Kingdom, that's what we call it, and in the United States, there's a large population of people whose human rights are not clearly well respected, and those are the incarcerated, the population of people living in prisons. Now, that, one might say, is a completely national problem, one that wasn't envisaged at all in 1948, the size of the expansion of the prison population. But that's also a set of issues that has roused interest and, to some extent, shock across national boundaries. So I think that the national and the international are mixed up in a way that wasn't envisaged in the foundation of the United Nations Association as a committee of men in suits representing other men in suits.
Point made. We have very little time left before we call Gordon and the rest of the commissioners up, and we allow you to ask questions of any of us or them. But I just would like to probe one topic before we close this section. And Anthony, let me start again with you. You've written widely on cosmopolitanism, and you think a great deal about this from both a philosophical and a legal perspective. So this is the Global Citizenship Commission. So what is this? What is this thing we call global citizenship? And is there anything, I'd ask each of the panelists to just close this section by, is there one constructive step that you can think of after Anthony enlightens us on the nature of global citizenship that the Commission should undertake to advance, in the spirit of the Declaration, the cause of global citizenship?
Well, I think it's an important fact about the long history of the idea of cosmopolitanism in the West, that it never meant to be, or it rarely meant, a commitment to the abandonment of local government and its replacement by world government. And this is, the word cosmopolitan means cosmopolita, citizen of the world, but, and that might imply that you want to have a global polis, you want to have a global, as it were, village that has a village government. And I think one of the most interesting things about it is that the metaphor has mostly been understood to say, look, yes, we have responsibilities and relationships with one another that are analogous to the relationships between fellow polites, fellow citizens of a single society, and that those generate responsibilities and concerns, but it's fine that people go on living in different societies because there are different human, what John Stuart Mill called experiments of living. There are different ways in which human beings, both individually and collectively, can explore, which are decent ways of living, and there's no one solution to the problems of how to organize either individual or social life. And so it's a mixture of a shared concern for one another and a recognition that we have responsibilities to anybody, to everybody, which we have to figure out how to discharge, and that includes creating institutions like the United Nations through which, and our own governments, to discharge them, with the thought that it's fine that the world is a world of multiple individuals and also multiple societies interacting with one another, but still each making its own way. And I think that's, for me, the core of the idea of global citizenship is, yes, we have responsibilities to one another, but they're the responsibilities that are consistent with recognizing that we live in different groups. And of course, for Americans, this is very easy to grasp because we have both, I'm a citizen of the state of New York and of the United States, and I have different responsibilities to the two. And I think it's just a sort of wider extension of that thought. And this is important to say because cosmopolitans have often been thought to be enemies of the local. I think that's exactly topsy-turvy. Cosmopolitans are people who've always recognized the importance of the local as the place we live, but seen it as something that has to be embedded in a wider global network of localities. And that is inevitable now, given the way we now live. I mean, it might have been weird for Diogenes of Sinope, who seems to be the first person to say this, didn't know much about most people in the world because he lived in northern Turkey, or what became northern Turkey, and he didn't know that Japan existed. Now you can't not know that Japan exists wherever you live, and so we're bound, I think, to think of each other as connected in some way or other. And all I want to insist on is that it's consistent both to celebrate the importance of global citizenship and to recognize that people nevertheless have homes that are local in particular.
In pursuit of this, is there a tangible step that you hope that the Commission will take?
I think that one part of the Emma mentioned this a little bit at the start, one part of the declaration says that all of us, individually and collectively through our institutions, have the responsibility to generate a kind of culture of respect for human rights and I think that's, as it were, part of the culture of the global citizen, is to think deeply about what these are, to think about what each of us can do in our own lives to sustain them, to hold our own governments to them, to make sure that our own governments hold the United Nations to them, and the European Union to them, and the African Union to them, and so on, and to take that seriously. But that has to begin, I mean, if it's really to take hold, it has to begin in the lives of the young. People have to grow up aware of the fact that they have rights and that generates the responsibility to sustain the world in which the rights can be realized.
Greg?
Well, let me agree with Anthony that whatever most people using a phrase like cosmopolitanism have or haven't done, it ought to mean, as he says, this both-and relationship. And I'd go further and say it ought to mean change in the local. So the way to be an effective citizen of the world is partly how you're a citizen of your country or your town. And whether you engage in your local citizenship in ways that recognize the global issues. So it's not leaving the local for the global, but it does change that. So if you begin to engage in recycling because you're conscious of environmental issues, you're connecting. If you campaign for local laws that take account of global situations. So it's worth recognizing that the majority of the legal implementation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not in international law, it's in national law. It is countries that put into their national law respect for global human rights. And I think that's key. And if you ask about tangible things now, well, it's key to how we deal with something like climate change. We face this enormous issue. There's a human rights dimension. There's not just the dimension of do we save the world from climate change. It's who suffers and who doesn't suffer as this proceeds. Are there island states that are submerged with rising sea levels? And how do we care for those people? Do we accept them as immigrants? Do we provide funding for them to relocate elsewhere? Do we respect their right to maintain something of their culture and the integrity of their culture while relocated or only go as individual refugees. So it's what we do in shaping our national or even more local lives and laws that speaks to what will happen to people all over the world and to whether there will be a really just respect for their different rights.
John?
Yes, the vision of the global village is fast rushing on us, and there's nothing anybody can do about it. Nobody can opt out of the changes. When you look at pandemics, like HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, and things like that, infectious, highly infectious. Today it's here, tomorrow it's in Europe, in Africa, or America. And so the efforts to contain or curb, eradicate must be through interdependence. Then you have the financial crunch, for instance. Supposed to have started in the United States, but it caught on through Europe to Asia, even Africa. We all suffered from that. And then, as Craig has said, climate change. Not even the most developed among us have solutions. And then the onslaught of the change is causing so much devastation all over in the United States, Europe, Africa, island states, and now I believe scientists are agreed that mankind must hold together to try to stabilize things. Otherwise, perhaps within a decade or two, we may all be overwhelmed. If we are faced with all these challenges, then the logic is that perhaps it's global citizenship. The responsibilities must be borne. The term is common but differentiated responsibilities. So citizenship is on us globally. And so this is where we're going. And I like the development of the concept of efforts without borders, like Médecins Sans Frontières. People are moving everywhere. It's not just in medicine. In other fields, the civil society organizations, NGOs, philanthropists, they are going all over the place to help people to help themselves, because when it affects them, it affects the rest. So this is it.
Emma, we'll give you the last word before we call up the others.
Well, we're in a great educational institution here, and a particularly internationalist educational institution by its own history. I do think that citizenship is a great deal about learning and teaching and the curriculum, and I think it would be wonderful if not the sort of heroic version of the history of the European Union or the history of the UN, almost a sort of corporate history, but just the ordinary day-to-day history of what these international and global institutions we've been talking about became part of what people studied in class, with all its problems and all its difficulties and its occasional successes. And I think that's part of thinking about what citizenship would be in the next generation.
Could you join me in saluting our four panelists, please? Now, are you going to bring...
Thank you, and it's now time to introduce the balance of the commission to you. If they would stand and come back on the stage, there's some seats in the back. Okay, Robert Schrum, who is the Warsaw Professor of Practical Politics at University of Southern California. Okay, Ronald George, 27th Chief Justice of California, retired in Los Angeles. Jeremy Waldron, the University Professor at NYU and also Professor at Oxford University and Chair of our Philosophers Committee as well. Okay. Thank you. Laurel Bellows, the Bellows Group Principal and also the immediate past President of the American Bar Association. Mohammed El-Baradei, the Director General Emeritus, International Atomic Energy Agency and Nobel Laureate. Paul Boghossian, Silver Professor of Philosophy, New York University, and head of the Global Institute of Advanced Studies. Thank you. And the Right Honorable Gordon Brown. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. What we'd like to suggest you do is think of a question or comment or reaction or a question about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I know that our co-sponsoring institutional leaders of the philosophers Dieter Stürmer and Michael Forster and also Marcus Gabriel had indicated they may want to speak, and there is a microphone over there which we invite you to stand in front of if you wish to express a comment, make a suggestion, or ask a question of the Commission as a whole or any specific member. We do hope that we can use the remaining roughly 20-25 minutes for this purpose, and we do welcome your comments. Okay, go ahead, Michael.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
If you would introduce, I know we've already introduced you, but if you'd introduce yourselves for the record, that'd be great. Thank you.
Michael Forster from the International Center for Philosophy. Thank you all very much for your points. I found this discussion very interesting. I wanted to raise a question about the Universal Declaration that doesn't concern the individual prescriptions or proscriptions involved, but rather what philosophers would call the meta-ethical assumptions behind it. It calls itself the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think that's really quite an ambiguous term in a certain way. Does it mean that these are rights that everybody has, these are duties correspondingly that everybody has, or does it mean that everybody is already implicitly committed to that moral principle? And insofar as it means the former, I don't want to raise a question about it at all, but I think many people in the room would have worries about the latter assumption, and talk about, as in the preamble, about inherent dignity. Sounds as though it's tending in the same direction of assuming something like an objective set of values written and inscribed into the universe independently of human beings that's implicitly accepted by all human beings everywhere, every when. And of course, there are very good reasons for being skeptical about that view. There are many philosophers even today who do hold such a view. There have been throughout the history of the human rights declarations from the 18th century. Enlightenment thinkers often held these views as well, but a more naturalistic and empirically informed view, such as, for example, many historians or anthropologists, if I dare mention the name, would take, is very, very skeptical about that assumption. So that's the sort of negative point. And then the positive point is, if that really does turn out to be a mistake, isn't there a very good alternative approach that one could take of, for example, being struck by the fact that even if there is no such thing as a universal commitment or an objective set of values out there, there's an extraordinary degree of agreement in the modern world, in the current world, between, fortunately, many of the most influential nations, also some of the less influential, and individuals in other nations too, that one can build on, providing the core of the human rights prescriptions and proscriptions. One can work from that basis towards more agreement through dialogue, through events like this and so on. Wouldn't it be better perhaps to drop the natural law-like meta-ethical sounding remarks at the beginning of the declaration, or to clarify them in a way that would push us in that direction? That's a rough question I'd like to put to you.
Jeremy. You would like to? Jeremy?
Thank you, Michael. I think it would be a terrible mistake to drop the language of dignity from the preamble. You're right, it's not universally accepted, and even among those who accept it, there are different meanings, and everybody who accepts it knows that there are depths to its meaning that haven't yet been plumbed, but we don't build our ethics and our commitments on absolutely fastidiously precise, completed propositions. We build them on a shared sense that there's something of momentous importance about every individual. And people come to that sense from different directions. Sometimes they use the idea of dignity as a sort of plateau on which they can stand, bringing an overlapping set of foundations, an overlapping set of foundational ideas to this notion that, come from where you may, there is momentous importance to what happens to individual men and women in the world, and we are going to build on that sense of momentous importance, not just treat it as a pragmatic idea that we happen to have adopted for convenience in the meantime, but to try to express this much deeper, even if it is a partly inchoate sense.
Go to the microphone.
Yes.
Philosophers never give up, as you know. If I just say one thing about that, the question wasn't about whether dignity is an extremely important, perhaps even the most important value. The question was about the nature of a claim of that sort. Is that a claim about there being written into the structure of the universe a value of that sort, that it's being implicitly accepted by everybody already, or isn't it perhaps a claim that has a different status? You know, for example, I mean, I think the universalist, objectivist sort of side of things tends to get away with the idea that if you take those statuses away from moral claims, somehow moral commitments become trivial or merely subjective, or taste or something like that. If I have a child, and I think the world of my child, but I'm not pathological enough to think that my child is sort of objectively or mind independently better than everybody else's child, does that mean that I don't have a deep, deep commitment to my child? It's not trivializing the nature of these moral prescriptions and prescriptions to shift their meta-ethical status, as it were, necessarily. And then I'll leave it at.
No, I think you're right. We certainly don't want to be in a position of saying everybody has to come to the declaration with certain commitments about the universe, or about God, or about the transcendent being of human beings. Some will, and I wouldn't disparage that for a moment. Others will come simply because they are horrified by what has happened. Others will come because they see something affirmatively good in human beings. And as I say, people reach this plateau from many different directions. The Declaration doesn't subscribe to any philosophical theory. It uses categorical language. It says human beings are important, and we're going to hang on to that proposition no matter which direction you come at it from. So I would emphasize this business of overlapping consensus.
Paul? Thank you, Jeremy. Paul?
Sorry, just a brief word. I think the question Michael raises is a very important one, much debated, of course, among philosophers, and without resolution, as you might expect from a deep philosophical issue about the status of moral truths. One important point, though, that I think you may have been overlooking is that in between saying it's built into the fabric of the universe and saying it's purely subjective, there's a huge family of theories that can ground it in human judgment, ideal human judgment, and without necessarily either falling into the trap of thinking it's somehow impersonally built into the fabric of the universe or God-given, or on the other hand saying that there is endless acceptable variability in what's accepted as a moral truth. And the very fact that you are emphasizing that there is real disagreement out there, that can only be made sense of if we think that's real disagreement about what is true, about moral obligation, moral rights, moral responsibilities. And one of the remarkable things about this document is that there's a huge set of actual substantive moral principles that have been accepted by an enormous variety of cultures and people from around the globe, which shows that A, there is a commitment to the idea that there is such a thing as moral truth, never mind its ultimate nature, and secondly, that there is a way of finding out what it is.
Thank you. Next. Thank you.
Yeah, Marcus Gabriel. I'm
Yes.
the other director of the International Center for Philosophy here, and
We
I
thank
hold the
you.
chair in epistemology, contemporary philosophy. But this is not going to be one of those, what's the nature of ethical truth questions, where I largely disagree with the territory that has been sketched. I'd rather like to know from some of the political agents in the Commission whether you have had any actual experience with the kind of data that is sometimes debated among philosophers. I'm thinking about something like this. So, what does it mean for someone to deny human rights? So how is this even possible? I mean, almost everybody would agree about the truth of something like the following propositions. Every human being is a human being. So how is it, and we doubt that someone who is not willing to implement human rights would deny the truth of that proposition. So, which I think raises the question, where does actual disagreement come from? And then you might say that there's definitely extra philosophical disagreement about specific things written down in the declaration, which has led to a certain form of resistance towards the earlier declaration in the form of something like, many of the values that went into this particular document, just think about unemployment hasn't mentioned yet, which is, of course, a topic in this declaration. So what would it even mean to think of the right to work as a human right? Many people would say, well, look, this is incompatible with our economic situation. And I'm particularly thinking about the human rights discourse in China, where you get where you often hear something like the following argument. Currently, we're on the process of hyper-industrialization, like you folks in Europe were before. So just give us some time, etc., etc. So I would like to know how you deal with these situations, which I think can probably not be resolved by the kind of a priori reasoning that we philosophers engage with. So I do think that what we can do as philosophers is give a certain foundation and avoid confusions about the role of values in ethical and political discourse. But then, after that's solved, there's still something to be done. So I'd like to hear really something about your experience with that.
Since you asked about that and not about philosophy, I'll take a crack at it. First of all, not in my lifetime or maybe even in yours will the world fulfill the whole Declaration of Human Rights. I think it is by its very nature aspirational. It sets out ideals that people strive toward. I also believe that there are folks who would say, who would deny your proposition in some sense. They would say, not every human being is a human being in the same full sense that I'm a human being. You see that with some of the parties on the right now in Europe, who seem to think very differently of other people than they think of themselves. So I think this aspirational aspect is very important. I also think that it's critical to understand that universal, to go back to the other question, and I think your questions are actually related, universal cannot mean universal approbation. When the civil rights bills were passed in the United States in the 1960s, a substantial portion of the country was strongly opposed to them. There are still people who are opposed to them. But people did answer Martin Luther King's call to the idea that there was a moral obligation to create a more equal society. Or as President Kennedy said, that what we faced with civil rights was a moral crisis. The first time any president had ever said that. Now, people didn't parse that. They responded to the inspiration of it, and they set up a set of ideals. So, do we want someday to make sure that everybody does have the right to work? Yes. Can that happen today, instantly, in the world we live in? No. Do we strive toward it? Is it a guiding star? I think the answer to that is yes.
Thank you, Bob. Laurel?
So that I can see you as well as you see me. Doctor, I don't think that people believe universally that people are, by virtue of being born, have the inalienable rights that I come to as an American. All right? So first of all, throughout the world, women aren't allowed to own property. In fact, they are not people in the sense that we might think about people. Do I have a right to vote? Do I have the ability to marry who I choose? Do I have the freedom from violence? Am I a weapon of war? So disagreement is much more basic than I would hope. These barriers should have been eradicated years ago, and we should have the conversation that you would like to have about more aspirational goals. That's number one. Number two, I clearly believe that we are dealing both with a combination of substance and aspiration. I think that's essential. In 1948, I think they were dealing with a combination of substance and hope, and creating a model for how we would like the world to be. And lastly, back to inalienable, I do believe that what we're doing is stating that when you receive the spark of life from wherever it comes, whatever your belief is, having received that spark of life, nobody can take your rights as a human being away from you, because they are given to you by some force other than government or other than those who are trying to remove them from you.
Thank you, Laurel. Professor Sturmer.
Yeah. Dieter Sturmer, Chair of Philosophy at Bonn and Director of the Institute of Science and Ethics and the German Reference Center of Ethics in the Life Sciences. I happily join the chorus of praising the 48 text, and I think if we take a big picture, you see on one hand the social issues definitely are not solved on a global scale. You already have mentioned this. And we certainly have, and that might be a big practical problem for you, more cultural and political disagreement, because the consensus in the 48 declaration was overwhelming, and it's hard to believe that this kind of consensus can regain, so to speak. So one probably has to work with it very, very carefully. And I like to inquire more intimately in your vision of human beings, or your vision of the image of man, and that relates probably kind of to these problems of universalism versus relativism. Because if you look at the development of human rights in the beginning, you have a very limited, privileged group of people. Going back to your country, Magna Carta, where privileged people, claimed certain rights. And then we see over 1,000 of years an extension in terms of addressees of human rights and an enrichment in terms of content. So I want to know, what the shape of things to come. And I think you have to work with kind of a vision of human well-being. It doesn't obviously has to be formulated in a very universalistic sense, but we need some hints. And you already mentioned, there's so much already in the text. My pet articles in the Human Rights Declaration are the 24, 25, 26, where you all have it. You have well-being, you have education, and it's often overlooked. You even have scientific advancement, because that's another issue. That we have the dramatic advancement of scientific progress, but only very limited people who benefit from it. On the other hand, the dangers, the perils of global scientific advancements, is a peril for everyone. So I like to hear from the Commission, what your idea is, and whether you're so daring to come up, despite this relativistic criticism, with a vision of human well-being.
Would like to?
Well, this is a fascinating question, and I thank you for it. Should I say, before people think that this Commission is 90% men, that we are here today without Aung San Suu Kyi, who's the Burmese leader, who's a member of our Commission, without Gracia Machel, who's the widow of Nelson Mandela, who's also a member of our Commission, without Kate Reagan, who's the Justice in South Africa, and many others who are not here today. So I hope you will see in the final report that this is a very balanced commission, and I hope you'll appreciate that, we are very lucky to have the commissioners here today, but there are others who are sitting on the commission as well. And we are indebted to Jeremy Walden. I should say that his philosophical work is an inspiration to me and to so many other people, and Jeremy, thank you for what you are doing to make possible our work. Now, I think the questions really come down to what is the practical implementation of what we are discussing. And it's really interesting in 1948, when the declaration was actually agreed, that they could not, these were the Cold War years, remember, they could agree on what the rights were, but they couldn't agree on why these rights were as they were. So the same problems that have been raised at the beginning were also problems they had in 1948. But we cannot deny, surely, that what was stated in 1948 was held by so many people to be important that it inspired most of the movements for change in the next 50 years. And I think particularly of one of the greatest movements for change, Nelson Mandela. And when he was in prison and pleading for change in South Africa, one of the documents that he kept referring to was the International Declaration of Human Rights. And it influenced him in two particular ways. One is to fight for the end of apartheid, which he did successfully. And second, on the night before he left prison in South Africa, to bring together all the African National Congress activists who could have been excused for wanting to take recriminations and retaliate against what had happened to them, and telling them that also they had to eschew bitterness and they had to build a multiracial society in South Africa where they could have been entitled to take revenge and retaliate against those people who had practiced apartheid against them. So we cannot deny that the International Declaration of Human Rights has had a huge influence. Now, where in the future do I see great change resulting from the work that we're trying to do, but also the inspiration that comes from the past? I think one of the great civil rights struggles of our time is the right of women, and particularly girls, for basic social and economic rights. And I've seen it at first hand being in Pakistan, with Malala, the girl who fought for her right to education, and now thousands of girls in Pakistan demanding their right to education, sometimes against their fathers and the patriarchs who are saying that that is not a right that they should be entitled to. And I see it in Nigeria today, where we have the 200 girls who've been abducted and kidnapped, but a movement of opinion in that country that says that no sect, no faction, no extremist group should prevent the right of girls to go to school and should deny them that basic right. And I see it in the right being demanded in Bangladesh by girls themselves, that they should not be married off at 10 or 11 or 12 against their will. And they've even formed child marriage-free zones. I see it in people's demands, particularly girls and boys, but also adults, against the slavery of either child labour or labour that is forced labour. So I think the International Declaration is inspiring a new generation of people, but I think we've got to be clearer than we were about the rights of women, about the rights to not be discriminated against on your sexual proclivities, and the rights, of course, of children themselves. And we were not concrete enough in setting out these rights in 1948, but the document itself inspires people to action. And I think if you're thinking of the civil rights struggle of our time, it's going to be won, because the girls and those people who are affected by this exploitation are not just going to give up. I would look to these changes, that the sooner they happen, the better, but you in this audience, can play a huge part in achieving it.
Thank you. Let's please state your name, please.
Yes, thank you so much for this brilliant statement. This is my issue. My name is Brunhilde Hoffmann. I'm representing two women's organizations, the National Council of German Women's Organizations and UN Women National Committee for Germany. I'm just taking up this issue. I would never dream of changing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because I think it is a good document, and if you try to open it, you never know what will happen. But since it is your mandate, I would like to ask you to introduce into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights the equal rights of men and women and the principle of that women's rights are human rights. It is contained in preambular paragraph 5, but it is not contained in the declaration. So this is my plea. Thank you very much.
Mohammed?
Well, Ms. Hoffman, it's nice to see you, but I don't think our mandate at all is to change the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think we made that very clear. I'd like to start by saying that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not the end all, for all times. What we are trying to do is to, as Emma mentioned, this is a part of our human project, if you like. We try to see how we can, each one of us, achieve his or her own potential. We developed the so-called democracy project, and we're still trying to refine that. We developed the so-called human rights, and we're still trying to refine that. In 1948, obviously, some of the rights were still fuzzy, some of the rights were still missing, and what we are trying to do now is to try to see how we can make people aware that some rights are missing, like women's rights, disabled children, for example. How we make sure, and that's very important, how we make sure that rights are being implemented. We talk since in the 40s when President Roosevelt talked about the 4 freedoms, freedom from fear, from want, freedom of expression, freedom of belief. Freedom of fear is all over the place. Freedom from want, half the world lives under $2.50 a day. So we need to put our foot on the ground, and we need to look at the big picture. Yes, we still have to refine what does it mean a right to work, what does it mean a right to national health, how we can implement that. But this is still an evolving process, and we are not trying in any way to say, we're starting from scratch. That's not the issue. We're trying to build on what we have. We're trying to deepen our understanding. We're trying to always be aware that we are very fallible, that until today, if you look at our history, we have fantastic, amazing of improvement in natural science, in communication, in humanities, but look at social science. Our history is a history of war interrupted by short spells of détente and peace. So we're far away from where we need to be. Where we need to be, as I mentioned, is every one of us feel that he is free, that he has dignity, no matter how you define dignity. I think we all know what it means to have dignity. But we are trying to work together. Eventually, I think we are, so far at least, we understand that to do that, we have to understand that we are one family, that irrespective of our ethnicity, religious color, what have you, we're part of the same family. And we have to live together. And we have to make sure that when we are fighting each other, we do not resort to wars, but try to communicate, try to understand the art of compromise. There's a lot we have to do, but I can assure you that we're not in any way changing the declaration or abolishing the declaration or amending the declaration. We're trying to build on what we have.
Thank you, Mohammed. Laurel, very quickly. Thank you.
Yes. In additional answer to your question, which I find very important, Article 2 and Article 7 of the existing declaration speak directly to non-discrimination and the rights of all people. But we are also considering recommending gender-neutral language, all right? And I think that your point is that perhaps given the lack of progress over 70 years on some things, on rights that we would assume would be a matter of course as it relates to women, that we might need to give different emphasis to the fact that Article 2 and Article 7 actually do grant women the right to be considered people. So I think one, gender neutrality in language that we're talking about, and two, the fact that although the rights are covered, the first reading, even for me, left me feeling that there was not enough emphasis on a world where human right violations seems particularly skewed in violations against women.
Thank you. Next question, please. No, I'm afraid we need to move.
My name is Heide Schütz.
Yes.
I'm the president of Women's Network for Peace here in Germany, and I was a participant at the UN World Conference on Women in Beijing, and I have been to the UN Commission on the Status of Women as an observer for many times. There was a campaign. I would like to draw the attention of the respected commission here and to the people who are listening to another issue that has been on my mind since I've started to study philosophy. How come that war is a legitimate thing, and Article number 1 of the Human Rights says that every person has the right to life? To my understanding, there is a big controversy, a contradiction per se, and I wonder if this could be touched by the Commission, or maybe it has been touched already. And I know that at the NGOs, among those who are representatives to the United Nations, there has been a campaign to delegitimate war. I'm not saying that I dream that all wars will be abolished tomorrow, but it makes a big difference whether war is legitimate or whether it is being delegitimized. Sorry, this is a difficult word. I'm not of English or American origin, so I would love to.
Thank you.
I would love to hear an answer to that, but also I would like to point out that the women's issue, and especially the fact that women's rights are not something special, but that they are human rights. This was brought up at the World Conference on Women in Beijing, the 4th World Conference, and it was very important because human rights are always put prior to women's rights. And some countries get off by saying, well, our culture is ahead of what you call human rights, you know? So I was very glad when I learned just a few minutes ago that, of course, we need to create a culture of human rights. So then the contradictory between national culture and the culture of human rights fades away.
Okay.
So thank you.
Is that Jeremy or
Mohammed? Yeah, very briefly, war is illegal since we adopted the United Nations Charter. Under the UN Charter, use of force is only in the case of self-defense, armed attack, in fact, or collective security measures by the United Nations. So the use of force is illegal since 1945, except if there is an attack against your own state, then you defend yourself, or if there is an authorization by the Security Council.
And even then, it cannot be justified unless there is a good cause, your intention is honorable, that you take proportionate action, that you understand that the bad that is done could outweigh the good, and it's a last resort. So I think international views on this are very clear.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
Next speaker, please. And I guess we'll try to make this a little, we'll try to finish everything, but don't worry if we run out of time, because you can always submit a question to globalcommission@nyu.edu and we will respond. So thank you.
Good evening. My name is Patrick Donnelly. I'm from Washington, D.C., and I'm a student of language here at this fine institution. The seismic result of last week's European election can be interpreted as a reaction to austerity and desire by the populace to withdraw from international cooperation. And my question is inspired by the Prime Minister's anecdote about Olof Palme and Ronald Reagan. And it's this: has the West declined enough? Or is it necessary for the West to experience a further substantial decline in standard of living in order to achieve global justice?
I think you're talking about the impact of global change on people's lives and the insecurity they feel and the questions they are asking about how their prospects are going to be in the future. And so we're in a different wave of globalization, and therefore we are seeing the reaction to change in the rise of anti-immigrant parties. We're seeing it in the rise of protectionist movements. In some cases, we're seeing it in the rise of xenophobic movements, political nationalism, which some people thought might have been less prevalent in an era of global interdependence, becoming the way that people try to protect themselves and insulate themselves against change. So I think there are deep forces at work. When I was chairman of the International Monetary Fund, there was demonstrations every meeting outside the meeting. And I remember one of the posters that was outside the meeting with a group that was organizing the demonstration, and it said, "Worldwide Campaign Against Globalization." And you can understand the frustrations that people had. They were trying to come to terms with massive upheaval and dislocation in their lives, and they're looking for answers from those people who claim that they can devise the policies that are right for them. And the real challenge, it seems to me, is to balance this desire to have your cultural respect and the diversity that your culture represents with the need for us, as I was saying earlier, to recognize we're in an interdependent world. And when Anthony was talking about cosmopolitanism, it wasn't at the expense of people's local, regional, and national identities. It was recognizing that we had also, in this interdependent age, to be citizens of the world. Now, I think as a result of what happened in the 2008 crisis, we've got a huge work of education and explanation to do to explain that these global forces have got to be managed, and the issue is, will they be managed well or badly, and can they be managed with better cooperation to deal with problems that cannot be solved, simply cannot be solved by America, Germany, or even the euro area acting simply on their own.
Yes, but I'm not talking about identity. I'm talking about standard of living. Isn't it necessary for the rich part of the world to experience a decline in the standard of living in order for the developing world to rise? And where is the balance?
I think that would be a catastrophe. It would be a catastrophe if standards of living sharply decline in the western part of the world. I think you would see more of a reaction to the right. You would see more closing in. You would see less concern with the rest of the world. Look, the Marshall Plan and all the things that happened after World War II happened in a period of unprecedented prosperity in America. I think we would all be in a much diminished world if the standard of living in the West declined. That's not our challenge. It's to bring the standard of living in the rest of the world up, not to bring the West down.
Thank you very much. Next question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
First of all, good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
And thank you a lot for a great discussion. So we hear, first of all, I'm Mariana Singh. I'm a student of this university, and we heard a lot about human rights, so I'll try to make my question short. I would like to bring an example. I would like to take one country. I would like to ask about Ukraine. How do Global Citizenship Commission and United Nations protect human rights in Ukraine? So let's take the period from November last year till today. And the next two sentences, is it only the theory, or should we talk about implementation? I'm a representative of, let's say, younger generation, and you are about to revise this declaration, but I'm much more interested in implementation and actions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anthony?
Yes, I remind the question
Okay,
because
okay.
it was from the very beginning. What did Commission and United Nations do to protect human rights in Ukraine?
So we do two things. We've talked a lot about implementation in the sense of being alert to what is happening, making accurate reports of what is happening, getting the voice of those to whom it is happening, to insist that the truth about human rights becomes public, including the truth about human rights violations. We spoke also this afternoon in one of our sessions about humanitarian intervention and the possibility of military intervention to prevent large-scale and egregious human rights violations and atrocities. And when we talked about that, we talked a little bit about the risks, and we talked about a new theme which is important about responsible protection, intervention when it does take place, that is sensitive to the impact that it's going to have, to the long-term consequences that it's going to have, intervention that takes responsibility for what is going to happen. Now, the third point is a point that has already been mentioned, that unilateral changing of boundaries, unilateral stirring up of aggressive activity in another state is unlawful. And your question is, well, it may be unlawful and it may be a violation of human rights, but what is being done about it? All the time when we think about implementation, there are heartbreaking choices to be made. Many of them about the ability to intervene. Many of them are about the possibility that intervention does more harm than it prevents. And we work, and sensible statesmen and women work with the idea, first, do no harm. If you can only make things worse, stand back, at least militarily. It doesn't mean you don't bear witness to what's happening, and it doesn't mean that you don't impose sanctions or give important recognition to the violations that are taking place. That's the array of ideas that we had on this point. We didn't develop them specifically with respect to Ukraine. We developed them with respect to some disgraceful failures in the past, the Rwanda genocide. We developed them with regard to some other areas where there was less disgrace and more initiative, like Kosovo. But we developed them in full awareness that the choices are heartbreaking and the responsibilities are massive.
I think you've got to accept that responsibility to protect is being developed as a concept, but it is related almost entirely to crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. And of course, it is dependent on the existing status quo within the United Nations, where one country has a veto in the Security Council about what might be authorized by the United Nations. And therefore, international law and practice is not easily able to cope with the situation that you're talking about. Condemnation, economic sanctions, but the responsibility to protect is a pretty underdeveloped concept at this stage.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, the Right Honorable Gordon Brown and the other members of the Commission who are traveling around and seeking the input of people all over the world. Another member of Parliament who I very much revere is William Wilberforce, who lived during the 18th and 19th century and who was instrumental in ending the transatlantic slave trade. Like many people during that time, William Wilberforce was unaware of the horridness of the slave trade until he saw a ship and he saw that was ported at a port and saw the slaves laying in their feces and their vomit, and how half the slaves would die on this trade. And the abolition, the act of abolition then was accomplished in the last year of his life, 1833, which led a great blow to the slave trade. And nowadays, we see a similar part where people are unaware of horrid things, and even people who are aware of them, they may justify them on perhaps religious grounds. In the case of slavery, the sons of Ham, that they were cursed to be subservient to their brethren. Perhaps nowadays, when we consider the use of mind control technologies and mind interfacing technologies on people, and people are unaware of these, and people who are unaware of them, they may not say anything because they are silenced by either psychiatric discrediting protocols, or that they are they think it's the turning of the age, which it is. But that does not mean that we will not do anything to stop the moral crisis that is involved. So my question is, in the wake of the petitions which are going to human rights organizations all over the world, and especially since the 9/11 and the increased military budgets have increased the number of victims, whether this time around the UN Commission will be able to enact an article banning the non-consensual use and experimentation of mind interfacing technologies.
But I was actually going to pass the question to Anthony, because it started off about slavery, and there is no one who's written more eloquently about how slavery was abolished and what you need to do to root out bad practices than Anthony. And perhaps on a more general level, the issue of how you shame people into action might be something that, Anthony, you want to refer to, because that is what you've taken out of the experience of abolishing the slave trade and what William Wilberforce did.
I mean, I don't know enough about what it is that you're talking about, so maybe I'm in the position of William Wilberforce before he saw the slave ship. Look, I mean, if I may broaden it to something that I do know something a little bit about, the question of, I mean, all the time we're developing new medical and neuropsychological techniques. We're developing new psychotropic drugs and so on. And there are questions that arise about when it is and isn't legitimate to use them, which are very much central to the field of medical ethics and to bioethics. So while I don't have in mind exactly the problem that you raised, it does seem to me that there may be, on the one hand, there are already in many of the existing human rights documents and language resources for thinking about what you may and may not do to people against their will, including in relation to doing things to affect their psychological condition. But it's also true, I think, that we face new challenges because the range of things that we can do to people now is increasing, and it's something that I think it's reasonable to want to be vigilant about. But I don't think any of us has yet discussed the possibility of developing any specific language to deal with the sorts of things that I think you have in mind. But I repeat, there's plenty of material in existing thought about human rights to protect people from at least some of these imaginable interventions. But we are going to have to develop, as we do all the time, new applications for old ideas, and maybe some new ideas to think about the new challenges created by scientific advances in our understanding of how to influence people's minds.
Thank you. We're a little bit over our time. We'd like to let the last two speakers speak. If you could ask a very crisp question, a short question, we could do it.
If you're interested in learning more, there is a retired government scientist by the name of Robert Duncan. He has two books called Project Soulcatcher and The Matrix Deciphered. And I would also say that you are really you are a great hope, because the governments, they've signed the Statutes of Forces Agreement, and they are not allowed to talk with their government, or they're not allowed to do anything, or else they'll lose their part in this technology and this experimentation. So please consider. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And if you would step forward, and if you have a very short question, we'll do our best.
Sure. Hi, I'm Aurora. I'm a student at school. I'm trying to get my A levels, and at the same time studying at this university in politics and history. And firstly, I'd like to thank you for coming, especially Gordon Brown. I hope one day I'll deliver a speech only half as good. Also, Mr. Gordon, your university, London School of Economics, I've been stalking that since over a year through the internet.
Okay.
And I'd also ask you not to misunderstand me, because I believe in the United Nations, and I believe that that's probably the most important thing humankind has ever developed. But my question really is, how can the United Nations fulfill their promise of equality of rights when the United Nations as an institution is divided into two groups who have different rights? How can you fulfill a promise while not keeping it in your institution itself?
Okay. Good question. And Craig.
Let me respond first by thanking you for your interest in the LSE and encourage you, come and debate this kind of question. The United Nations embodies terrific ideals, and it is part of what we have hope for. And it faces some big problems, and this bears on other questions, the question of Ukraine or others. The UN does not have autonomous capacity to do things, so it is dependent on its member states in various ways, and it also is shaped by the member states in terms of its internal structure. So the first thing is that you have to realize it's not some separate thing unto itself, but because it is governed by the member states, when they are in disagreement, the disagreements are passed into the UN. When there is division of the rich and the poor, the powerful and the not, it gets passed into the way it works. And the UN tries to deal with this and reduce those differences, but it can't escape them. And when there is a division, when in a situation like Ukraine, there are these competing considerations. Well, yes, that's bad, but of course we have to worry about oil and gas for next winter. Yes, that's bad, but of course we wouldn't want to wind up with greater conflicts, whatever. These sorts of difficulties are not simply inside the UN. The UN tries to work with and address these things with the challenge that member states may not be behind strong action or may not be in agreement with each other. They're not just two groups. There are some binary divisions in two, but there are lots of divisions, and sadly, there are internal inefficiencies. There are agencies pursuing their different agendas, competing for resources within the United Nations, say, oh no, human rights is not the most important, economic development is the most important. Oh, it's neither of those, it's peace, and we should focus. And each of these can become a source of competition. The challenge, you should come be a part of dealing with the challenge, is both inside the UN to get it to work better and more efficiently and more cooperatively across these agendas, and between the UN and the different countries that are its members, which keep constituting these splits, these divisions, these limits on action, and this halfway house between, yes, we want the UN when we like what it's doing, but we don't want it when we don't like what it's doing.
Thank you.
But on the specific question of the veto and the permanent member,
the Security Council, I guess.
Security Council, there has been a very serious attempt towards reform. I don't know if Gordon would agree, but I'm very hopeful that there will be progress towards reform, and eventually getting rid of the veto, well, that depends on large power politics, but I think there will be some movement on UN structural reform and the two classes as it's presently constituted.
Thank you.
Well, I still have millions of questions, but thank you.
Thank you very much. global.commission@nyu.edu. Please send your questions. Last short question. Thank you.
Maria Oberga, former member of the European Parliament. As Mr. Brown,
approached the issue that I was envisaging to raise, specifically the grave violations of children's rights affected by armed conflicts. I'll limit myself with a recommendation, if I may. Please think of a user-friendly version as well. And I'll give an example of a good practice. The EU's Fundamental Rights Agency is having an online tool, Chartapedia, an application for mobile devices, and an e-portal to help not only professionals but the wider public to get the orientation in the landscape of human rights protection. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always nice to end on a constructive note. Thank you very much. Please thank the members of the Commission and Chair Gordon Brown. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And I do need to thank once again our co-sponsors from the University of Bonn, Rector Vollemann, and our wonderful professor and Chancellor, and our help from the various institutes headed by Michael Forster, Dieter Strömer, and Marcus Gabriel. Please thank them. Thank you. And we have been blessed with a terrific staff. I'd like to highlight Melissa Friesen and Jen Gordon over here. Please give them a hand for their assistance. And from the University of Bonn, Dr. Stefan Zimmermann has been terrific. Thank you. Okay. And as I said, if you do have questions or comments or other reactions that you'd like to send to us, global.commission@nyu.edu. We will do our best to respond promptly. We thank you for your attention. We stayed over time, but we really appreciated your attentiveness and your interest. Thanks again, and we will see you. Bye-bye.